Well, good evening. It is very good to be back here in Bible study once again. The holy days are past. We're getting into the book of Ezekiel this evening as we continue our survey through the major prophets, and we're going to look at the opening chapters, the first 16 chapters in the book of Ezekiel. Realize that of course, Isaiah and Jeremiah were written. Were written during the times of two of the last righteous kings of Judah. Isaiah was contemporary with Hezekiah, and there was a period of reform. But Isaiah looked beyond those reforms to know that there were problems coming, and sure enough, there were. Jeremiah, who was later, was contemporary with the time of Josiah. And Josiah was the last righteous king of Judah and the last period of reform. And within a few years of Josiah's death, in fact, probably about 4 years after Josiah's death in battle, the original Babylonian invasion came in under Nebuchadnezzar, and there were those who were taken into captivity, including Daniel. That's when Daniel went into captivity, about 604. Now, the book of Ezekiel picks up the story. Ezekiel had also gone into captivity. He went in the second captivity. There were three captivities. The first was in 604. Nebuchadnezzar took Daniel and those some of his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That group went into captivity. That was the early one. Then, a few years later, in about 597, the second captivity. See, that's just a matter of about 7 years later. 7 or 8 years later, Nebuchadnezzar came back, and he carried a second group. This time, he carried the king, Jehoiakim. He carried him into captivity because he was pretty upset at the way he was handling things, and he took another group of people. Ezekiel went in that captivity. And in fact, he dates his prophecies in Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 2, in the 5th day of the month, which was the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity. So Ezekiel actually dates most of the book of Ezekiel from the time of Jehoiakim's captivity, which was about 597. Then we come on down, see just about 10 years, actually about 11 years later, Nebuchadnezzar came back the third and final time. That's when he destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and took large numbers into captivity. So Ezekiel is writing during this period, within a few years after Jehoiakim's captivity, but the city and the temple are still intact. But Ezekiel is foreseeing the ultimate destruction of the city there at the during that particular time. Now, Ezekiel 1 verse 1, it came to pass in the 30th year, on the 4th month, the 5th day of the month, I was among the captives by the river Kabar. Now, that's an interesting opening because you'll find that various commentaries will have different will have different interpretations of what that means. Some of them think, well, means maybe Ezekiel was 30 years old, and some of them say that. The Jewish commentary makes an interesting point that this was their statement is that this was 30 years after Josiah's Reformation, Josiah's Great Passover, and they say was the 30th year in the Jubilee cycle, the 50-year Jubilee cycle. Now, I don't know that we can definitely prove or disprove that it was the 30th year of the Jubilee cycle, but from a chronological standpoint, it was 30 years after Josiah's reform. That part does seem to line up as you check the dates, and their contention, and it's just simply a matter of tradition, that would tie in with the last Jubilee time. But anyway, this was Ezekiel was by the river Kabar. Now, one of the things, it's important to understand the book of Ezekiel and important in understanding it because most of the commentaries completely miss the point because they don't understand the distinction between Judah and Israel. And throughout the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel keeps talking about Israel, and he was a Jewish captive. Well, most of the commentaries, because they really don't grasp the distinction between the Jews and Judah and Israel, they just sort of mesh it all together. And the result is they totally miss the point. You see, Israel, the 10 tribes, Judah and Israel split into two totally different kingdoms after the death of Solomon. 200 years went by as separate kingdoms. Israel, the northern 10 tribes, went into Assyrian captivity. They were settled up in the northern area, sort of between the Black and the Caspian Sea, up on the northern reaches of the Euphrates and north of that. It was over 100 years later, 100 and basically 20 years later, that the Babylonians invaded. By this time, Assyria has passed from the scene. Nineveh has been overthrown, and the Babylonian Empire has come to power. Babylon was centered down in the southern Euphrates area, down, let's say, just north of the Persian Gulf. Babylon came in, and they took the Jews captive to the area of Babylon. Israel and Judah were taken captive to two different places by two different empires at two different times, separated by over 1 century. And Ezekiel, as we go through the book of Ezekiel, clearly understood the difference between Judah and Israel. That is emphasized throughout his book, that there was a distinction, and he understood what it was. But one of the other things is that while Ezekiel was a Jewish captive, he had a message that was primarily directed at the house of Israel. Now, God wanted to impress on Ezekiel the distinction or the importance of this message. And it's crucial that we understand that. Ezekiel was a priest. He, we're told, was by the river Kebar, which was a tributary of the Euphrates, down in the area near Babylon. And Ezekiel had this remarkable vision in Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 5. He looked up and he saw a whirlwind coming out of the north, a great cloud and a fire enfolding itself, and brightness was about it. It was this incredible thing. I mean, at first it looked sort of like a tornado coming at him. And the closer it came, the more details he was able to make out. And you can imagine what a frightening thing it was. I mean, first it was like a whirlwind, and then as it got closer, he saw all these flashes of light, this great brightness, and as it got closer, he was able to discern. He saw these creatures, these strange-looking creatures that it describes there, and they had 4 faces. Now, if you have 4 faces, you've got one advantage. Verse 12, you're always going straight forward. See, everyone went straight forward. They didn't have to turn. I mean, you never had to turn, because if you have 4 faces, whatever direction you're going, that's straight forward. So Ezekiel noticed that, and that evidently impressed him. He thought, so he saw these angelic creatures. You know, you and I read some of that, and we think that sounds sort of strange, but God's probably got all sorts of creatures in the angelic realm that he designed and created that serve various functions in the angelic realm, some of which may have counterparts on earth. There are certain animals. In fact, these creatures have 4 faces, and each of those faces has counterparts with different creatures on earth. Some of the creatures that are described in the book of Revelation and elsewhere are, some of them look like men, and some of them look pretty strange. These had their function. Here they are, that they're moving pretty rapidly. Verse 14, the living creatures ran and returned as the appearance of a flash of lightning. So that's pretty rapid transit, It's, it is It describes there these wheels, and it talks about wheels within wheels, and it talks about this expanse of firmament. Verse 22, the King James says firmament. That just means an expanse. It looks sort of like crystal stretched above their heads, and what Ezekiel saw as he got closer, that above this great crystalline expanse, sort of like a sea of glass, I think is the term used in the book of Revelation. He saw, once it got close, verse 26, he saw the appearance of a throne, and this great bright throne, and upon the likeness of the throne was the likeness of the appearance of a man upon it. Now, he says it had the appearance of a throne and sort of the likeness of a man, because evidently it was very clear that it wasn't just a normal throne, wasn't just a physical chair, it wasn't just, there was something about it, just the light and the brilliance, that there was, it was clear to him that it wasn't like what he was normally accustomed to seeing, but that was the closest he could compare it to. And it describes the rainbow. And verse 28, this was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard a voice of one that spoke. Now, Ezekiel sees here this, it's like God is sort of moving through the heavens, and all of a sudden he shows up, and he's got his, you didn't know he had a portable throne, see? He's got these creatures down under there, and when it talks about this thing, it describes the wheels within wheels. That might be something sort of like a gyroscope. That's a wheel within a wheel, and it can turn and do all sorts of things. If you've ever watched one, it's a remarkable event. And so that's sort of what I visualize when it talks about and what he's seeing is materializing from the spirit realm. So it is dissimilar. It's not bound by the physical laws of our physical universe. It's another dimension. It's the spirit realm, and you got a different set of laws that apply. You got different things, and so what is happening is Ezekiel is being allowed to actually see in vision. He sees God coming here on this throne, coming to meet with him, and it scares him to death, which is probably pretty natural. When I saw it, I fell on my face. Scared him to death. He got closer and closer. I mean, different. He went through different kinds of fear. First, he thought a tornado was heading straight at him. And he said, "This isn't a regular tornado," And the more he saw, and he was just sort of mesmerized by it as he stared. And it got closer, and he could see more details. And when it really got close, and he saw what was really above there, it just it was very frightening. And the voice said, "Son of man, stand up. I got something to tell you." And so the Spirit entered in unto me when he spoke and set me on my feet. And I heard him that spoke. And he said, "Son of man, I send you to the children of Israel, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their fathers have transgressed against me even to this day. Impudent children, stiff-necked, stiff-hearted, I send you unto them. And you deliver my message. Now whether they listen or not," verse 5, "yet shall they know that there has been a prophet among them." Now don't be afraid of them. Don't be afraid of their words. Though briars and thorns be with you, and you dwell among scorpions, don't be afraid of them. They may threaten you, and they may say all these sorts of things. They're a rebellious house. You tell them what I say. And I want you to deliver my message. Now, one of the things we're going to see, the implication, the impact this has for us. Ezekiel was given a message to the house of Israel. Ezekiel only delivered that message to the extent that he wrote it down. Ezekiel had a warning of captivity and punishment for the house of Israel, but the house of Israel was in captivity, and by the time Ezekiel was writing, they'd been in captivity for over 125 years. So you'd have to say if Ezekiel was showing up to warn them about the Assyrian captivity, he was a little over a century late. It was not real good timing, sort of like being warned of something happening way back in the 1800s. Well, somebody showed up with a warning on that. You'd say, well, that's. But Ezekiel's warning. You see, Ezekiel's warning, as we're going to see as we're going through the book, God's message through Ezekiel to the house of Israel was for the end time. And Ezekiel's message must be delivered. Must be delivered. Must be delivered to those to whom it is directed. The message of Ezekiel really couldn't be delivered in times past. Number one, the time setting wasn't right, and it wasn't really clearly understood as to where to deliver it. You have to know the identity of Israel before you can deliver this message. Mr. Armstrong, there were people who grasped historical information and understood connections about the American and British people descending from Israel, but Mr. Armstrong was the one who understood the implications of that message. If you go back and read some of the things that I've read years ago, 30-some-odd years ago, in the Ambassador Library, I read some of the books, one in particular that Mr. Armstrong himself read. In fact, it was the very book he had read because his notes were in the margin, and he had underlined it. So I know it was the book he read. Had his name inscribed in the flyleaf. It was one he had read decades earlier. But you go through and you read some of those things, and you realize that while they had some historical information, Mr. Armstrong was the first one to grasp the implications of what that meant, to really understand what the book of Ezekiel, if America and Britain are descended from the 10 tribes of Israel, then the message of Ezekiel is for us today. That was something that others had not grasped. So God clearly, this is an important message, God clearly is impressing on Ezekiel. If you have a vision like this, you don't just sort of think, well, I wonder, I don't know if that's any big deal. When God goes to the trouble to do something like this, it's important. Now, he told Ezekiel in chapter 3, he said, eat this roll like a scroll. Eat it and go speak to the house of Israel. So he caused me to eat it, and it was sweet in my mouth, but he said, now go speak my words. In fact, he gave the message to Ezekiel. He said, I want you to internalize this. You're sent to the house of Israel, again, verse 5. But he told him in verse 7, the house of Israel will not hearken. They won't hearken to you. They haven't hearkened to me. They hadn't listened to me, so they're not going to listen to you. But he told him, he said in verse 10, Son of man, all my words that I shall speak unto you receive in your heart and hear with your ears, and go get you to them of the captivity unto the children of your people, and speak unto them. Thus says the Lord. So Ezekiel was taken up, and in this vision that the hand of the Lord was strong upon him, and he came to the captives, verse 15, that dwelt by the river Kabar, and he sat there just astonished for a week. And at the end of this week, God's word came to him and said, Son of man, I've made you a watchman unto the house of Israel. Therefore hear the word at my mouth and give them warning from me. He told him, he said, if you warn the wicked, if you know the warning and you don't deliver it to the wicked, verse 18, he'll die in his iniquity, but I will hold you responsible. If you warn the wicked, verse 19, and don't be turned, and he doesn't turn, he'll die in his iniquity, but you have delivered your soul. You've done what you should do. So the point is, Ezekiel was told there was a responsibility attached to that message. And so he was told in chapter 4 to take a tile and lay it before him and portray on it Jerusalem and lay siege and build a fort. Ezekiel was told, he's here in this little village of Jewish captives. And so he's told to go and to take a tile, big ceramic tile, and to lay it down there and make like a little model city, and to put little toy soldiers and little battlements and to just portray the siege of Jerusalem. And so, set battering rams, and he does this. But notice the point, verse 3, end of verse 3. This shall be a sign to the house of Israel. The siege of Jerusalem. The siege of Jerusalem was yet future. At the time Ezekiel portrayed this, the siege of Jerusalem was a few years away. Still about, perhaps about 6 years. This was about 6 years before the siege of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is still here, but while Ezekiel designs this and makes this little, like a little toy city, a little toy fort, this, gets people's attention. They're all coming around to look. He's told this is to be a sign for the house of Israel. Now again, remember, the house of Israel went into captivity 125 years earlier. Now Ezekiel was told, lie on your left side, and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel, verse 4, upon it. According to the number of the days that you lie upon it, you shall bear their iniquity. I've laid upon you the years of their iniquity, according to the number of the days, 390 days. So you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. When you've accomplished that, lie on your right side, and you'll bear the iniquity of the house of Judah. Now, did Ezekiel know the difference between Israel and Judah? Is he talking, is he just using them interchangeably? Well, as Judah, here he uses a period of 40 days for just about the time people thought they had Ezekiel figured out. I mean, he's going out there every day, builds this little toy city and all the fort and everything, people coming around looking, what in the world is that? They look at it. Every day Ezekiel goes out there and he lies on his left side. He does it for over a year. 390 days. Over a year. Every day going out there. By this time people think they've got Ezekiel figured out. I mean, he's going to come out every day and lie on his left side. One day, day 391, Ezekiel comes out and he lies on the right side. Now that really got them confused. What in the world? You're on the wrong side, Ezekiel. No, I've finished that. I'm on the other side now. So he did this. And the point, Ezekiel is acting out something. And this is one of the things important to understand from prophecy. God uses the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem as a type of the entire Great Tribulation. You see, the siege of Jerusalem was a sign for the house of Israel. In a way that God didn't use the siege of Samaria to typify what was going to happen in the future. This is different. He uses the siege of Jerusalem, and what happens? It's interesting. You see, years earlier, Jeremiah had written the book of Lamentations as a prophecy. He wrote it in the aftermath of King Josiah's death, and he wrote it as a prophecy of what was going to happen. Now, the prophecy had sort of three levels. One was what was literally going to happen within a few years after Josiah's death. The Babylonians were going to come in, and within a generation they would have taken the city and destroyed it. And so that was, the book of Lamentations describes that. But the city was rebuilt, and many centuries later, the events that Jesus described in Matthew 24 in the Olivet prophecy, Jerusalem was again destroyed, this time by the Romans, on the very anniversary of the time it had been destroyed by the Babylonians, centuries later. And so the book of Lamentations, when you tie in with what Christ said in Matthew 24 and with the facts of history, there was a fulfillment by the Babylonians during Jeremiah's lifetime. There was a fulfillment many centuries later in the first century, 70 A.D., but those events, when you read carefully what Jesus said in Matthew 24 and the parallel accounts of Mark 13 and Luke 21, you find really those events of 70 A.D. were themselves a descriptive, they were a type of events that were going to happen at the end time, our day. Not just simply to Jerusalem, but to the house of Israel. So Ezekiel shows this. This is to the house of Israel. And what we find is that many of the things that he goes through, Jerusalem, of course, was the only place that was the place, the only place where the throne of David had ruled over all of the 12 tribes. So Jerusalem always represented or had significance for the entire 12 tribes, because that was the capital that David and Solomon had reigned from. Now Ezekiel is given information, and there are things that he goes through relative to the impending destruction of Jerusalem, which lay a few years ahead. But again, it was a type of something bigger. As we go through the book of Ezekiel, we will see increasingly that Ezekiel's message has implications beyond that day. It comes on down to the end time. Ezekiel was told in chapter 5 to take a sharp knife, a barber's razor, and he was to shave his head and his beard. And folks, they didn't know what Ezekiel was going to come up with next. I mean, first he was into building model cities. Next thing he came out, he was bald as an onion. He'd shaved his head and shaved his beard, and then he weighed it out. And his hair and his beard, and he weighed it out, and he divided it up. And a third of it he burned up, and they took another third. This is in verse 2, and he chopped it up with a knife, and the third part he threw to the wind. People are standing there, and what in the world is that? And there was a little bit that he took and bound it up in the skirt of his robe. And so God's message was, he says, verse 5, this is Jerusalem. Now, remember, what happens to Jerusalem is a sign for the house of Israel. That is the key to understanding the book of Ezekiel. That the events concerning Jerusalem are a sign to the house of Israel. Chapter 4, verse 3. That is a key verse that helps you make sense of the message. So, God says what this has to do with is that ultimately, verse 12, a third part of you shall die with disease and with famine, be consumed in the midst. A third part fall by the sword round about, then I'll scatter a third part into the winds. So, this is an incredible prophecy. When you talk about a third of the people dying of disease and famine, a third being killed in warfare, and a third going into captivity, this is a sign for the house of Israel. So God talked about how he would make them waste, verse 14, and a reproach among all the nations. And he would break the staff of bread, verse 16, would send famine and evil beasts, and they will bereave you, pestilence and blood. I'll bring the sword. So there is horrible destruction. And the Scripture speaks very clearly of it. Now, Ezekiel was told in chapter 6, the word of the Lord came and said, Son of man, verse 2, set your face toward the mountains of Israel and prophesy against them. You mountains of Israel, hear the word of the Lord God. Thus says the Lord God to the mountains, to the hills, to the rivers, and the valleys, I, even I, will bring a sword upon you and destroy your high places. Your altars will be desolate, your images broken. Verse 6, in all your dwelling places the cities shall be laid waste. The slain, verse 7, shall fall in the midst of you. Yet, verse 8, will I leave a remnant, that you may have some that shall escape the sword among the nations when you're scattered through the countries. That they that escape of you shall remember me among the nations where I've carried them captive. And they will loathe themselves, as it says in verse 9, for the evils that they've committed. Verse 10, they shall know that I'm the Eternal, and I've not said in vain that I would do this evil to them. So he talks about this destruction, all of which, remember, again, is a sign to the house of Israel. Chapter 7 goes on. Verse 2, you, son of man, thus says the Lord God unto the land of Israel, an end, and the end is come upon the four corners of the land. Now is the end come upon you. I'll send my anger. So he describes they will be recompensed for their abominations. Verse 6, an end is come. The end is come. It's a day of trouble. Verse 7. Verse 8, I will pour out my fury upon you and accomplish my anger, judge you according to your ways, recompense you for all your abominations. The day, behold the day, verse 10, behold the day, behold it is come. In the verse 12, the time has come, the day draws near. So clearly, this is the day of God's wrath. It talks about, the context is the end time. And verse 19, they'll cast their silver in the streets, their gold shall be removed, their silver and their gold shall not be able to redeem them in the day of the wrath of the Eternal. Now, this is is referenced as you come on back as to Isaiah talks about this. The book of Revelation talks about this. Clearly, the time setting goes beyond. See, what happened to Judah, what happened to Jerusalem was a type for the end time. Jeremiah talked about the time of Jacob's trouble, of which clearly this is describing. But Jeremiah referred to the time of Jacob's trouble, there's none like it. A day that there's none like it. Daniel talks about a time of trouble such as there's never been. Jesus talked about that in Matthew 24. He said there will be a time of trouble such as never been. Now, you can't have several different periods of time that are all worse than any other time it ever has. Christ made plain that the events that had happened in the past were types of the end. They were descriptive of the kinds of things that are going to come. He describes that, and he describes how that when the time comes, chapter 7, verse 14, they've blown the trumpet even to make all ready, but none goes to the battle. Now, that's a little bit of an enigmatic statement, and I can't give you a full explanation, except to just call your attention to it and bring out the point that when the final time comes, there really won't be an all-out battle. Somehow or another, things won't respond, and when America is attacked, the trumpet is blown, but none goes to battle. They try to make ready, but it doesn't work. There are all sorts of. You could come up with all sorts of scenarios to try to explain that, but the sword is without, verse 15, the pestilence and the famine within. And it's not going to be a matter, people want to look at physical things. And, they're going to lay in stock, they're going to store up gold and guns and hide away in a cave somewhere. They're going to find out that their silver and their gold is not going to deliver them. Ultimately, what God is going to have to convince everyone of is there's only one source of security, and that's Him. The only source of security is having a relationship with God. You can... What other source of real security is there? Well, what if you were a millionaire? Well, that'd be a lot of security. What if you were a millionaire, a few weeks ago? You knew you were a millionaire because you had just gotten your latest statement from Enron, where all your money was invested. You had a lot of Enron stock. You were a multimillionaire. Well, all of a sudden, the numbers followed by all the zeros. All you had left was the zero. We look back at the stock market crash of '29 about people jumping out of a building because everything had evaporated. We think, well, we're too sophisticated. Something like that couldn't happen today. Well, it can. It's an illusion. Physical security is an illusion. Say, well, I'm not going to have to worry about food. I got my deep freeze full. That's good. Let's, hurricane comes through or tornado or something knocks out all the electricity for a week, and everything you got in your deep freeze is rotted by the time the week is over. I mean, there are things you and I can do, and that's all well and good, but those things are no guarantee of security. They're no guarantee of security. I mean, it can burn up, it can blow away, it can be washed away with a flood. There are all sorts of things, and they happen all the time, all over the world. The point is, the only real source of security is God. And that's the safest place to be. God's the Lord High God, the possessor of heaven and earth. When Jesus spoke, the wind stopped. The waves of the sea were smooth. The disciples marveled. They said, well, even the wind and the sea obey His voice. Well, of course they did. It was His voice that called them into existence to begin with. Of course they obey His voice. And see, that's something for us to keep in mind. What do you have to be afraid of? Everything has to obey the voice of God. Everything. There's no storm too great. There's nothing that is overwhelming. So it's crucial because, you see, when all the physical things begin to collapse, as they do, Ezekiel was told in verse 23, make a chain. This is chapter 7. Make a chain. The land is full of bloody crimes. The city is full of violence. I'll bring the worst of the heathen. They will possess their houses. I'll make the pomp of the strong to cease. Their holy places will be defiled. Destruction shall come. They'll seek peace, and there will be none. Mischief shall come upon mischief. Rumor shall be upon rumor. That's going to happen. Boy, it's incredible when disasters start happening, how rumors just spread. All sorts of things. You can just hear just about anything. Make a chain. The land is full of bloody crimes. One thing links to another. You see, it's all linked together, and it's just this horrible situation. God is going to allow these things to come about. Now, here we are about a year later, chapter 8, the 6th month, the 6th year, the 5th day. Ezekiel was sitting in his house, and the elders of Judah were sitting there, and the hand of the Lord God fell upon me, and a likeness like the appearance of fire. And he sees this being, and the Spirit lifts him up in verse 3 between the heaven and the earth, and he's taken in vision to Jerusalem, to the door of the inner gate. And he's brought there, and verse 4, behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, according to the vision I saw in the plain. Now, it's interesting because what Ezekiel sees unfold here in the next 3 chapters, chapters 8, 9, and 10, Ezekiel sees the departure of the glory of God from the temple in Jerusalem, step by step, until it's moved out. It's interesting, if you go back to the time when Moses dedicated the tabernacle in the wilderness, what are we told? The glory of God filled the tabernacle. See, God came down upon the mercy seat, filled the tabernacle. Priests couldn't even come into the inner courtyard. Centuries later, when Solomon built the temple and the dedication of the temple, you remember the story, you can go back and read in Chronicles and Kings, the dedication of the temple, the glory of God filled the temple. It was like this bright glowing cloud just came down. It was so overwhelming, even the priests had to move back. The glory of God filled the temple. God had described, you see, that He would sit above the cherubim, above the mercy seat, and there He would commune. What Ezekiel sees, you see, Ezekiel is writing just a matter of about 4 or 5 years before Nebuchadnezzar destroys the temple. One of the things the Jews had placed confidence in, they said, it's God's temple. It's God's temple. Solomon built it. The glory of God filled it. Nothing's going to happen to us. All we got to do is stay close to the temple. Now, they had set up idols, and they'd set up all sorts of false worship, and they'd done everything imaginable. But, it's the temple, the Lord will take care of us. You don't hold God captive. God got to the point he was so disgusted, he got up and moved. And Ezekiel records the vision of the glory of God leaving the temple. Now, when the glory of God leaves the temple, what you got is an empty building. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar destroyed. He destroyed the empty building. And interestingly enough, the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat, there's no record of exactly what happened to that. Nebuchadnezzar didn't take it captive to Babylon. There's no record of it in any of the annals of what the Babylonians claim to have taken captive. And there's some of those things that have come down. There's no reference to it. Later on, there were some of the sacred drinking vessels and things like that. There were many things that were taken, treasures from the temple, but the ark was not there. Nebuchadnezzar didn't take it to Babylon. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly what happened, but it wasn't taken to Babylon and didn't come back from Babylon. What exactly transpired, we don't know. I would suspect that it was removed and hidden at some point, probably right around or shortly after this vision. If you connect the significance of the glory of God departing, that was what was symbolic of God's presence, the physical item. That was where the mercy seat was, and we don't know exactly. It doesn't say. Jeremiah was a priest, and I'm sure that some way or another God inspired, perhaps, I would think through Jeremiah, since he was the one who was God's chief servant in Jerusalem, whether him directly or priests who were loyal to God and who followed Jeremiah's instructions, that the ark was at some point removed from the temple and taken and hidden away somewhere. And but Ezekiel sees this vision. He sees he's brought here in vision. He's actually transported. In this vision, he's transported from the river Kabar over to Jerusalem, and he sees the temple. And he saw the glory of God, verse 4, and he sees these abominations. He's told in his vision, he says, look, in verse 6, you see the great abominations the house of Israel commits here? He brought me to the door, and I looked, and in his vision there was a hole in the wall. So he could look right through the hole. Remember, this is happening in vision. God wants him to see. So he sees the great abominations. And he saw all sorts of creeping things and abominable beasts and idols of the house of Israel, verse 10. And then he saw 70 men of the ancients of the house of Israel. And notice that he says, verse 12, Son of man, have you seen what the ancients of the house of Israel do in the dark? Every man in the chambers of his imagery, they say, the Lord sees us not, the Lord has forsaken the earth. Oh, God's not paying attention to things down here. He'll never notice. I think that's such an interesting phrase, what they do in the dark. It's like people think God doesn't have good night vision. If you turn out the lights, he'll never notice. It's incredible the things people are emboldened to do in the dark. And that's why in some of these places, nightclubs and all this sort of stuff, they turn the lights down real dim. People, give them a few belts of booze and turn the lights out, and boy, they feel emboldened to do all sorts of things that they wouldn't think of doing out in the parking lot at noon. That sort of put a damper on things. If you all of a sudden turned on the lights, it'd be like, a bunch of roaches scurrying for the cover, But people are emboldened when the lights are out. And it says, you see what the elders of the house of Israel do in the dark. It's a very interesting phrase and one for us to keep in mind because, there's no place where you can hide from God. What are you going to do? And God will never notice. We live our lives before God. We live our lives in His presence. And it's an important concept to realize. And you think about sit down and sup, eat a meal. You think about that and you realize, there are a lot of people who would really be thrown into a tizzy if they knew that Christ was standing at the door knocking, because they'd have to go. First you have to change channels. See on the TV, or take out that video and hide it and stick in Little House on the Prairie or something. Got to change channels. Got to hide stuff. Here, quick. It is a good concept for us to keep in mind that it is because if we want God's presence in our life, then would we be made uncomfortable if Christ came to join our fellowship? Would we have to change the topic of conversation? Would we have to make? Well, there was a time when He was walking the earth, and there were people that were glad to see Him come. When He showed up there at Mary and Martha and Lazarus' house, they were glad to see Him come in. And if we want His presence, we want that. It's just, I think, a good concept to keep in mind. So anyway, God's going to show him greater abominations. Verse 15. I'm going to show you greater abominations than these. Brought him into the inner court, and there at the door of the temple, between the porch and the altar, 25 men with their backs toward the temple, their faces toward the east, worshiping the sun toward the east. Now, that's a sunrise service, because the only time the sun's in the east is at sunrise. So if they're facing the east, and worshiping the sun, we're looking at a sunrise service. And so here a few days ago, we had folks that went out to participate in an Easter sunrise service. Well, God says that's an abomination in His sight. And He talks about, is it a light thing? Verse 17, to the house of Judah that they commit abominations. They fill the land with violence. So it comes on in chapter 9. And the glory, here we find that he sees these 6 men, verse 2, and they had a slaughter weapon. Each one had a slaughter weapon in his hand, and one man among them was clothed with linen with a writer's inkhorn. And they came and stood beside the brazen altar. Now, the brazen altar was inside the holy place. That was where the incense was offered. That was where, as it was spoken that in ancient Israel, when they were told to build a brazen altar and to offer incense, that they would commune, that God would commune with them from above the mercy seat. So here they are, standing at the altar of incense, the brazen altar, and the glory of the God of Israel, verse 3, was gone up from the cherub, whereupon he was, to the threshold of the house. And he called to the man with linen that had the writer's inkhorn. And the Lord said, go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and set a mark upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and cry for the abominations done in the midst. And then to the others with their sword he said, go through the city and smite. But don't come near those that don't come near those that have this sign upon them. You see, that was the don't come near, verse 6, any man upon whom is the mark. Begin at my sanctuary. So what we find is, one, a setting apart of those who obey. A mark or a sign has to do with designating someone, setting them apart in some specific way. The mark of the beast is a mark of disobedience. Here we look at something that sets apart the obedient. because as the destruction begins, those who are going to be spared are those that it describes as sighing and crying for the abominations. In other words, they're people who are repentant. They're people who are deeply disturbed by all of the things they see around them. They're not part and parcel of it. They're not enjoying it and getting their kicks from it. They're not a part of that system. They're deeply bothered and moved as they see what happens. And they're going to God. God makes a distinction between those whose heart is toward Him and those whose heart is away from Him. So this occurs, and he sees this. And so now in chapter 10, I looked, and behold, in the firmament, or in the expanse above the head of the cherubim, he saw the likeness of the throne, and he was told, he heard the man clothed with linen, told to go in between the wheels, even under the cherub, fill your hands with coals of fire, and scatter them over the city. And so this happened. When the man went in, the cloud filled the inner court. Verse 3. Then the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub, stood over the threshold of the house. The house was filled with the cloud. The court was full of the brightness of the Lord's glory. And so then the sound of the cherubim's wings, and so he hears this, and he sees this whole thing rise up. And in verse 18, the glory of the Lord departed from off the threshold of the house, and stood over the cherubim. And the cherubim lifted up their wings and mounted up from the earth in my sight when they went out, the wheels also that were beside them, and every one stood at the door of the east gate, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. And this is the same thing that Ezekiel had seen by the river Chebar. And so he describes it. And then he sees this, and the glory, finally, verse 23 of the Lord goes up. This is chapter 11, verse 23. The glory of the Lord goes up from the midst of the city and stands upon the mountain on the east side, the Mount of Olives. So God is removing himself first from the inner sanctum of the temple, stops over the threshold, departs from the threshold to the courtyard, and then out over the city, and then out from the city. So what Ezekiel describes is the departure of the glory of God. Now when we get to the end of Ezekiel, we'll see the return of the glory of God in a new temple, in a new in a new righteous Jerusalem. Well, Ezekiel sees certain individuals, leaders of the people, in Ezekiel 11 and verse 1. And in verse 2 he's told, Son of man, these are the men that devise mischief and give wicked counsels in this city. They say, it's not near. Let's build houses. The city is the cauldron, and we're the flesh. Therefore prophesy against them. Prophesy, Son of man. Verse 5, the Spirit of the Eternal fell upon me and said unto me, Speak, thus says the Lord, thus have you said, O house of Israel, for I know the things that come into your mind, every one of you. He describes all of the violence, all of the things that have gone on. So again, he addresses the house of Israel. We're looking at events in Jerusalem, but we were told back in chapter 4 that Jerusalem was a sign for the house of Israel. Again, the house of Israel is addressed. This attitude, it's not near. We'll just keep on doing business. We'll build houses. This society, this world, this culture, this civilization is just going to go on forever. The end isn't near. Everything's just going to go on. We're going to make money, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. That's the attitude. And one of these days it's going to call up short. And it's not going to be something that the world will have clearly foreseen. It's not going to be a projection, of the six-month trend that you'll hear the forecasters on CNN or something, and in about 6 months everything's going to collapse, the country's going to go into captivity. They're not going to have a clue. I mean, they're going to think that they're going to be able to maneuver and manage and the whole thing's going to crash down around them. So Ezekiel is told that in verse 17, therefore thus says the Lord Eternal, I will even gather you from the people, and assemble you out of the countries where you've been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel. And they shall come there, and they shall take away all the detestable things and all the abominations. And I'll give them one heart, I'll put a new spirit within you, I'll take a stony heart out of their flesh, I'll give them a heart of flesh. They'll walk in my statutes and keep my ordinances and do them, and they'll be my people, and I'll be their God. Now, has that happened? You know, the people that came back under Zerubbabel. Well, only to a degree, but they weren't given a new heart and a new spirit. They didn't have the stony heart replaced with a heart of flesh, because after a little bit of time, after Zerubbabel had passed from the scene, you pick up the story, and Ezra's coming back, and you got all sorts of problems. Ezra comes back. Does that solve the problem? No. About 12 years later, Governor Nehemiah has to come back. And he cracks the whip, and he runs things with a tight hand. But that doesn't really solve the problem, because after he died and went from the scene, you pick up the story and you find same old thing. Over and over. It hasn't happened. The context is the end time. That's when Israel is going to be, that's when the house of Israel is going to return. The house of Israel has never come back. And there's not been conversion. The Jews of today, some of the Protestants, they pick up this verse about I'll gather you from among the people and I'll give you the land of Israel. They'll quote that as though that applies right now. Well, I'll tell you what, they're not walking in God's statutes and keeping His ordinances. Yes, they were supposed to be back there, and they are, but those are other prophecies. This prophecy doesn't refer to that. It refers to a future regathering after the captivity, and it refers to all the 12 tribes. A time when people will be converted. You could go back to Jeremiah 31, when God will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. He'll give them a new heart, put His laws in their hearts and in their minds. So God says that, or Ezekiel describes then, verse 22, then did the cherubim lift up their wings and the wheels, and the glory of the God was over above them, and the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city. And so in his vision now, Ezekiel returns, and verse 25, I spoke unto them of the captivity, all the things the Lord had showed me. So he comes back to this little Jewish town, captive, where the captives were dwelling, there near Babylon, and he tells them about these visions. But that's not delivering the message to the house of Israel. And besides, those Jews weren't the ones in Jerusalem who were going to, who could repent one way or the other. I mean, they needed to learn their lessons. But Ezekiel's message and all these visions wasn't just for the benefit of a few Jews in a little village there on the river Euphrates. Notice in chapter 12, the word of the Lord came to me. He said, Son of man, you dwell in the midst of a rebellious house. They have ears to see, have eyes to see and don't see, ears to hear and don't hear. They're a rebellious house. So he is to prepare things for removing. And so anyway, he's goes through this, and he digs through the wall, verse 5, and he carries things out, and they're standing there and trying to figure out what he's doing. Verse 6, end of verse 6, for I have sent you for a sign unto the house of Israel. And so he says, describes this captivity, and the prince, verse 13, God says he'll be taken in a snare. I'll bring him to Babylon, to the land of the Chaldeans. Yet he shall not see it, though he die there. Zedekiah was taken captive to the land of the Chaldeans, and he never came back, but he never saw it either. You see what Jeremiah tells the story. He was blinded. Right before he left Jerusalem, the Babylonians put his eyes out. So this sort of enigmatic statement, I'll bring him captive to the land of the Chaldeans, but he'll never see it, though he died there. Well, what does that mean? Well, they couldn't figure that out. A few years later, it's very simple. Sometimes there are enigmas in Bible prophecy, and you look at it and say, well, what does that mean? Once it happens, you look and say, well, that's obvious. That makes sense. Yeah, that's what that describes. But you can't always anticipate. So God talked about scattering the people toward every wind, and then, after he'd drawn out the sword, verse 14, verse 15, they shall know that I am the Eternal when I've scattered them among the nations. And so he describes the famine here in Jerusalem. Verse 19 talks about cities being laid waste, and ultimately, again, people knowing that God is God. And as we notice on down in verse 26, let's pick it up in verse 25. I am the Eternal. I will speak, and the word that I will speak shall come to pass. It shall be no more prolonged, for in your days, O rebellious house, will I say the word, and will perform it, says the Lord God. Again the word of the Eternal came unto me, saying, Son of man, behold, they of the house of Israel say, the vision that he sees is for many days to come. He prophesies of the times that are far off. Thus you tell them, says God, none of my words are going to be prolonged anymore. People want to think it's way off. Won't happen to them. In Ezekiel chapter 13, he says, Son of man, prophesy against the prophets of Israel and against the foolish prophets. Verse 10, they have seduced my people, saying, Peace, peace, and there was no peace. One built up a wall, and others daubed it with untempered mortar. It describes here those who have set themselves to announce or to proclaim. Foolish prophets. The word prophet in the Hebrew refers to those who announce or who proclaim. I think when if you go back to Ezekiel 22, for instance, and you look at the description of the three categories of the leaders of society, the princes, the priests, and the prophets, I think clearly it spells out what that's talking about. The princes are those who control the economic and political power. They control the wealth and the political power. The priests are clearly the leaders of organized religion. The prophets, those who announce or who proclaim, turn on the television. You can run through all you pick up the magazines, the whole media, the opinion molders of society. Now, some of them are religious false prophets. The majority are secular false prophets. They have their own. They claim to speak authoritatively. They've seduced my people, saying, Peace, peace, and there was no peace. Oh, we're going to have this peace plan. We're going to solve the problems. It's ridiculous. They've built up a wall, and others daubed it with untempered mortar. It's sort of, it's like you build up a wall of loose block, and somebody comes along and whitewashes it and makes it look pretty good. But it's not substantial. All you got to do is push against it. And the whole thing begins to collapse. See, they've built up an edifice that is really not substantial, that won't stand the test of time. Say unto them to daub it with untempered mortar, verse 11, it's going to fall. There will be an overflowing shower when the wall falls. Verse 12, where's the daubing wherewith you've daubed it? The whole, the things that have built up, the ideas, the philosophies, the whole things that represent this society, basically, when the push comes, the whole wall, it's like a wall collapsing. It's been whitewashed, made to look a little better and more substantial than it is. God says in verse 14, I'm going to break down the wall that you've daubed with untempered mortar, bring it down to the ground so that the foundation thereof shall be discovered. You see, ultimately, God is going to show the flawed foundation upon which this society, this civilization, this culture, the ideas, the philosophies have been based. The foundations are going to be exposed. And, it describes here he ties into the false prophets, verse 16, that see visions of peace, and there is no peace. And then he talks about the daughters of your people, the women. He talks about in verse 19, will you pollute me among my people for handfuls of barley and for pieces of bread, to slay the souls that should not die and save the souls alive that should not live? You think of all these do-gooders who get all worked up about some trying to save the life of some axe murderer or something, and you're going to save alive those that should not live, and you're going to cause to die those that shouldn't die, because that's the flip side of that. Today there was this woman attorney up in New York that was arrested that evidently had been, she was American, and she had been passing on this Sheikh Abdul Rahman, this cleric that's in maximum security prison, had been responsible for all sorts of violence and bombings and things over here. She, in the guise of his attorney, was passing on his messages. He was supposed to be held incommunicado, where he couldn't communicate with his followers. She'd been passing on his messages. Oh, well, she wanted to help him. Well, it's the men, the women, in other words, the whole, the people of our society, the things, all the various things that they do, and God looks at all of this stuff, and He's pretty disgusted with it. So he goes on in chapter 14. Certain of the elders of Israel came and sat before me, and the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, these men have set up their idols in their heart. Ultimately, that is the chief source of idolatry. That's what we've done in this country. We have set up idols in our hearts. See, people think idolatry, well, that was way back then. People had these little crazy images, But ultimately, he says they've set up their idols in their heart. They've put the stumbling block of their iniquity before their face. You tell them, thus says the Lord God, verse 4, every man of the house of Israel that sets up his idols in his heart, puts the stumbling block of his iniquity before his face, and comes to the prophet, I, the Lord, will answer him. The house of Israel, verse 5, is estranged from me through their idols. Tell the house of Israel, verse 6, repent, turn from your idols, and turn your faces from all your abominations. Every one of the house of Israel, or of the stranger that sojourns in Israel. See, that's not only those who are physically Israelite, but those who are of other nations that live in Israel. If they separate themselves from me and sets up idols in their heart, then God's going to deal with them. I'll set my face against that man. So ultimately, God's going to bring punishment on the house of Israel, verse 11, that the house of Israel may go no more astray from me, neither be polluted any more with their transgressions, but may be my people, and I may be their God. So God's punishment is coming to bring the nation to repentance. That's something that has not happened. And he talks about these things happening even if Noah, Daniel, and Job were there. Verse 14, they wouldn't save anybody but themselves. So when the time comes, God is going to do it. And if Noah, Daniel, or Job were there, He'd deliver them, but He wouldn't deliver others. He's going to make a distinction between those who obey Him and those who don't. So God is going to make just like fuel to the fire, God's going to give the inhabitants of Jerusalem, verse 6, set His face against them and make the land desolate, verse 8. This is chapter 15. Chapter 16, he says, Son of man, cause Jerusalem to know her abominations. And so now he describes Jerusalem, he describes in the metaphor of like a child that had been cast off, and had been rescued and grew and matured and developed, came to young womanhood, and God then describes himself as marrying her, like the marriage of God to Israel. And he describes clothing them in let's say, the array of a queen. He describes beautiful clothing and jewelry and the things like basically the jewelry and the clothing that he gave them. Showing, by the way, that it's not wrong on proper occasion to wear to wear nice clothing. This is described like at a wedding or a bride or a queen. And so he describes the beautiful clothing, the beautiful jewelry, the descriptive of the beautiful things that God gave to the nation. He is described as adorning his bride. But then, verse 15, you did trust in your own beauty and played the harlot. So he describes, you see, that Israel was like an unfaithful wife, trusted. She didn't need to trust God as her protector and her defender and rely on him and be, do that. But rather, he describes Israel as playing the harlot, getting into illicit relationships. And he talks about the fact that ultimately they're going to be destroyed, and that they're quote their lovers, the allies, the ones that they have gone to, that they're going to come against them, and so Israel's unfaithfulness to God, and that's what's described as we go through here, and he describes Jerusalem as being like a sister to Sodom. And that's the way God views it. And remember, Jerusalem is a sign to the house of Israel. And he talks about in verse 49 the iniquity of your sister Sodom, pride, fullness of bread, the abundance of idleness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and the needy. They were haughty, committed abomination before me. So, as God looked at Jerusalem and what he described anciently, again, was a sign, was a type. The captivity that was going to going to come, that is an overview of some of these things as God is here dealing, inspiring Ezekiel to record an important message. Ezekiel was given a commission. He was given a job, a message to deliver to the house of Israel. Ezekiel delivered that message to the house of Israel in the end time by writing it down. God preserved it. For those who know and understand that message today, we have a responsibility to proclaim it. Mr. Meredith and Mr. Ames are doing that on a regular basis on the telecast. And, you see that, and you realize that message is going out. And it's going to go out further, and it's going to go out stronger. God's going to open doors. He controls the timing. He controls the timing. And clearly, it's not exactly the message is going out right now, but the door isn't as open as maybe you and I would like it. We'd like to shout it totally from the housetops. But, when that time comes, the door will be open. The real thing is, and those who are busily about their Father's business will have the opportunity to do it in a grander way when God opens that door. That's a matter of God's timing. I suspect that the full blast won't last just real long, because I think that we'll meet the same kind of popularity that Jeremiah got and some of the others. God's message has never been real popular. Ezekiel was told, hey, it's not going to be popular. They may threaten you, but that's okay. You got me backing you up. And that's what's needed. Mr. Meredith is not one to be easily intimidated, as anyone knows him, and I think that's Mr. Armstrong was. Anybody that knows him, I mean, God picks has picked men that would have the courage to deliver His message and would not tend to be intimidated. And ultimately, all of us, the real source that we have to rely on not to be intimidated is God's power and God's strength. But anyway, as we have this overview of the opening part of the book of Ezekiel, next Bible study we'll pick up the story in chapter 17 and go on through chapter 32. And so with that we'll be concluded.